And today we're going to look at the basics of public relations writing. And I want to preface this lecture by acknowledging that if you haven't had COM 2500 Introduction to Public Relations here at Western or a similar course at another institute, that is okay. We're going to talk about public relations and just kind of lay a very general foundation. But more specifically, and as this course is entitled, we're going to focus on the written aspect of public relations, which you're going to learn is quite large, right? Because in essence, what public relations practitioners do is to communicate most often in writing, whether it's through traditional channels like the press release or more contemporary channels, as in Twitter or Instagram. They are writing to strategically position an organization or an entity. Okay? So let's dive in. So the reason we have a standalone public relations class instead of just simply allowing you to do some writing in your introductory course or in your public relations capstone is because time and time again, for decades, practitioners indicate that the number one skill they look for in new grads and new hires is their ability to write well. As I was saying a moment ago, part of the reason for this strong need for writing is that our primary tool in public relations is the written word. It's the way in which we reach out and create relationships with internal and external stakeholders. It's the way in which we decide how to frame and position our organization or the entity in which we are representing. Right? So that's why we have a full standalone course in public relations writing, because it is the number one most desirable skill, because it is the strongest tool that we have as a public relations practitioner or as a professional communicator. To start off, as I acknowledged before we began this lecture, is we need to have a better idea, working idea of what public relations is in general. And that's something that you're going to look at this week when you dive into the discussion board and start to look at public relations and the way in which you see writing relating to this profession. So, just as a brief background understanding, we're going to walk through how public relations is similar and how it may differ from a number of other functions in organizations. So, first, in public relations, what I want you to think about public relations, equate it to the idea of a relationship in your mind, right? So, in many ways, public relations practitioners develop communication plans that will impact both the success and or failure of an organization or a particular entity. I've used the term entity a few times now, and what I mean by that is that in public relations, we're not always representing an organization. It might be a health campaign, right? It might be this idea of how many veggies and fruits do we need children and adolescents to consume a day. Or if we think about the rise in the individual celebrity, right? There you're not necessarily representing an organization, but you are still communicating on behalf of someone to help establish a reputation and maintain that reputation. And again, it's all about relationships. So whether it's an organization or you're representing a celebrity or a athlete, you're making sure that this person is seen in a positive light and they're connecting with their target stakeholders or the groups that they see that they have a common interest or bond with, right? And now, what's really nice in public relations, we've gotten to a place where this can be a two-way relationship. So, two-way communication. And again, I'm thinking specifically about social media and what that has done for this profession, where then all of a sudden it isn't a one-sided relationship where the public relations practitioners or team are creating these messages and just putting them out there for consumers to read and to think about, but now those consumers are able to converse back, right? Which can be very powerful, both in positive ways and negative ways. Public relations also works with marketing and other promotional efforts such as publicity and advertising in order to build advocacy and image building goals, right? So public relations is one particular function, and within that, we're able to use other tools such as advertising or publicity, which we'll chat about more in a moment, in order to reach our goals. Commonly confused with marketing, and a lot of times that's because organizations will have a marketing communication department or a strategic communication department, and they will kind of bundle public relations, marketing, communication, and advertising sometimes all in one. But when you think about marketing, think about the market, right? We're thinking about the bottom line here. So, marketing causes an economic transaction to take place to benefit an organization or an entity. They're thinking about the market share. Right? So, the market, in essence, is looking to say, what can we do strategically in order to increase our market share? So, we're really thinking about the exchange of money for goods or services there. Publicity, on the other hand, this is something in public relations, particularly if you're going for more of the entertainment industry. We're looking to figure out where, in what venues can I have photo opportunities, for example, right? What am I doing where I have this person or this organization positioned favorably? So it might be asking an athlete to attend some sort of sustainability effort or some other corporate endeavor that's going to position him or her in a positive light, where they're seen shaking hands with decision makers. It might also be the way in which we have other media outlets talk about our organization or the entity who we are representing. Advertising, and again, think of advertisements, right? So a lot of these we can look at the root words and make them a little bit simpler and easier to discern from public relations. In advertising, we're looking at controlled media, and we're going to look at that actually on our next slide. But controlled media advertising, we have people who work to create the perfect advertisement, right? So they're looking at the image, they're looking at the way in which the image is positioned, if we're using a filter, if we're using an upward or downward shot in order to position our organization as more approachable or as a larger power distance or gap. Spending a lot of time to look at fonts, to look at colors, to figure out what is that perfect tagline or slogan, right? And it's controlled because when we put all of that effort in to create this perfect ad, we are paying a good price for it, right? Depending on where we are taking that ad out, right? And we're paying for it because we want it to be represented exactly as we intended. Public relations, on the other hand, this is where we're presenting information. We're sending out press releases, we are tweeting, we're maintaining a blog, for example. And we're hoping that third parties, so either the traditional news media or more contemporarily, if we're looking at bloggers and other individuals who are in places of influence, we want them to look at what we're doing and to pick that up. And then we have the third party endorsement, right? So then it's not us paying to tell someone how great our organization is through advertising, for example. But we have a blogger. So let's say we have an education blogger who's looking at what we're doing at Western and recognizing we're doing really good things. So it's that education blogger then who goes on his or her blog and blogs about what a great value the education is at Western. So we're having someone who isn't paid by Western to say good things about Western. That, in essence, represents what we're doing through public relations. promised, we're now looking more specifically at controlled versus uncontrolled media. Controlled media, think about an advertisement, right? So this is something where we have complete control over the way in which the end product looks. Right? We were talking about, we spent time working with a photographer. We figured out with a graphic artist how this should appear. We've probably done some sort of focus groups to test a number of different slogans. And it is representing our organization or entity exactly as we want. And we are paying a premium for that, right? So think about the Super Bowl. Think about the amount of money these organizations are paying for 30-second spots. And that is representing the organization in the way in which they intended. Uncontrolled media, on the other hand, we're not paying for this, right? This is when the traditional media, so think about newspapers, we can think about magazines, just television, so typical traditional reporters. And more recently, if we're thinking about bloggers and other individuals who are influential through YouTube or through other forms of social media, when they're looking at our organization or our entity, when they're looking at the information that we're releasing about the services that we're producing, perhaps their goods, and they're saying, hey, this is a really good product, or this is a really good service, or this celebrity or athlete is doing really good things. So there, our credibility is inherently increased, right? And why do we have more credibility there? Because it's not us as a representative of our organization or of this entity paying to tell someone to use our product, service, or look at how good this person is. But rather, we have someone who isn't affiliated with the organization or entity speaking on our behalf, right? So we see inherently that's going to be much more credible. But at the same time, we have to remember that our intended message might be interpreted incorrectly. It might be altered in some way, and that leaves room for inconsistencies in our messaging or the way in which we want to be presented. In a couple of weeks, you're going to work on a press release. And when we create these press releases, it is in many ways still the best tool we have as a public relations practitioner. But news media or bloggers, they're able to take what they want and leave what they don't. They're able to rewrite it. They're able to run it as is. So when we do this uncontrolled media, we have to look and say there is a cost benefit to consider, right? Cost literally is nothing aside from our time, but it might mean that we're not being represented or the entity isn't being represented in exactly the way in which we had hoped. So now I want to walk through a couple of the different types of public relations writings. Think about these as big bucket approaches to considering the different tools that we have as a public relations practitioner. And throughout this course, this is what we're going to dive into more deeply, and you're actually going to create different examples of these types of writing and ultimately put them in an online portfolio. So if we think about traditional business correspondence, I want you to think about the everyday types of communications that are occurring in organizations. I want you to think about emails, both among employees in an organization, from the organization to employees, but I also want you to think about the way in which email functions from an organization to an external stakeholder, right? So what happens when you have a good or bad experience and you're emailing the organization, right? What does that look like when a PR practitioner or communicator engages in correspondence with you that way to develop a relationship or maintain a relationship? You can also think about letters and memos. Those tend to be pretty typical examples of business correspondence. Corporate and internal communication. There, we're going to expand a little bit. We can look at proposals. You can look at your annual report. Some of this might be copy that we're using for the intranet, right? The internal website for the organization. If we're looking at corporate communication, that also includes the external web, right? So the way in which we communicate so that we have those outside of the organization, the way in which they view us, the way in which they interact with us and develop a relationship. I want you to think about newsletter articles. And again, we have internal and external newsletters. We can have newsletters directed to our own employees, newsletters directed to consumers. Brochures are a good example of this as well. And also think about writing scripts, right? So in the summer course, because it's so condensed, we're not going to take the time to write a speech or a script, but we might do this, and oftentimes it is you as the public relations practitioner who is tasked with writing that script for the CEO or other C-level entities who are speaking on behalf of the organization. Publicity writing, and we're going to do a lot of this in public relations. Your news release, this is part of publicity writing, right? We are writing specifically in order to release information about our organization. And we're doing that with the strategic intent to develop or maintain relationships with stakeholders. So we want them to be in the know. We want them to know what our organization is doing. We want them to know when our organization has been acknowledged or awarded for something. We want them to be in this constant conversation. So in addition to news releases, there might also be some other background materials here. So we might consider, internal communication and corporate comm can have a brochure, so can publicity writing, depending on the intent of the brochure. In a couple weeks, you're going to create a fact sheet. That is another example of publicity writing. Marketing communication. And again, a lot of times we talked a few slides ago about marketing, think about market share. In many ways, these documents are designed in order to get consumers to make a purchase, to make a donation, to make some sort of financial commitment. So thinking about how this communication will help us to increase our market share. We might have think about catalogs, right? So when you're sent these in the mail, or more typically now when your email box is bombarded with sale ads, right? The way in which they present product and make it look attractive, so you're more likely to make a purchase. Any type of sales literature, direct mail pieces, right? The junk mail that you receive, and a lot of times the customer newsletter as well. There's ways there in which they are intending for you to see them strategically, to see them attractively, and as your choice of spending money. And advocacy writings in many ways is very different. These are when we're looking to speak out on an issue in many ways, right? We're looking to advocate for ourselves or other stakeholders who we see ourselves as representing. I used to work in the healthcare arena, and in here, especially when we started talking about changes to health insurance, to making sure that everyone had access to affordable health insurance, there were many instances in which I'd work with the CEO and other high-ranking decision makers to write letters to the editor to discuss different ways in which they thought that these new government policies and procedures would impact healthcare, would impact access to physicians, to testing, right? We can also do an op-ed commentary. We might do a position paper where we take a strong position either for something, maybe we think about new legislature that's coming in, or we take a strong position against something. And advocacy writing can also come about in terms of speeches. So what we have done so far is looked at the basics of what public relations is, we've differentiated it from a number of other somewhat similar functions. And we've talked about some of the major tools that we have at our disposal as a public relations practitioner or a professional communicator. So we're going to, in many ways, can take a more 30,000 level foot view, that macro view, and look at some communication basics now. These are things I'm not going to ask you to use these theories necessarily to as a foundation for the client work that you'll be doing this semester, but rather I just want you to be aware. We need to be mindful, and part of the reason we do this is so that when we sit down to do a press release, for example, we're not just sitting down to say, okay, well, I have to do this for Dr. O, or I have to do this because my boss is asking for it, but rather so we are mindfully thinking about the goal and the intent of every single document we're writing, whether that is an email to employees or it is a brochure that will be distributed to 5,000, right? We need to remember that is our job. In every sentence that we articulate, whether it's written or oral, it is our job to mindfully represent the organization or entity we're being paid to do so. And part of the way in which we ground ourselves is to remember the purpose, right? Am I writing this fact sheet or this brochure or this Instagram post? Is it informative in nature? Am I doing it to teach stakeholders something, right? Am I giving them a new skill? Am I persuading them, right? Do I want them to engage in a certain type of behavior, right? Are we trying to help people to figure out how to make smart food choices by baking rather than frying? And if we're thinking about persuasion, right, we can offer compelling information about why that would be a healthier choice for themselves and their family members. And the fourth, simply entertaining, right? Especially with the advent of social media and the need to post at a frequent pace, right? Sometimes we're able to show our stakeholders that we as an organization or entity, we don't take ourselves too seriously, right? That we are able to laugh, that we are able to engage in humorous communication with them. Another thing that we can do is to look at communication a little bit more simply and say that we have a source. That would be us as the public relations practitioner. We have a message, right? So we're going to develop this through the press release, through the brochure, through the op-ed letter we're writing. And then we have a receiver, right? Who is the intended message, or who is the intended recipient? Are we trying to reach out to employees? Are we looking at new mothers? Are we looking at college seniors, right? But figuring out, and again, this makes it very, very simple. This is a very, in many ways, an oversimplified approach to looking at communication, but all of the ingredients are there to figure out who's communicating, what they're communicating, and to whom they're communicating. So we're going from a very, very simple, the SMR model, to one that's a little bit more complex. We're thinking about the diffusion of innovation theory. And according to this theory, people adopt new ideas as the result of a 5-step process that includes awareness, interest, evaluation, trial, and adoption. And so what does this mean for you as a public relations student, maybe a future practitioner, the very least a communicator? It means that you need to be thoughtful in choosing the strategies and tactics that are appropriate for each of these levels in order to be effective. So certain techniques, such as publicity and brochures, work best in the awareness and interest stages, while more directed methods and one-to-one communication have more influence on acceptance and adoption of messages and ideas. Right? So it means that we need to be mindful of where our stakeholders are in the adoption process. Right? And if it's simply awareness, we need to be mindful that their communication needs are going to be very different than when they're actually at a point where they feel comfortable trying a new product or service. And that they may need a little extra persuasion to move from trial to adoption. An example I like to use here is think about how many new medical interventions there are. And specifically, let's think about how many different prescription pills there are, right? Big money business organizations stand to gain a lot of money through this. And so they hire drug representatives who are very good at understanding diffusion of innovation theory, so that when they're going to talk to different physicians at their in their hospitals, in their offices, that they're able to to provide information about why this new pill or intervention is better than competitors or earlier models. They're able to pique interest oftentimes by providing statistical information, anecdotes, right? So they might present the stories of some patients who have gone through trials, the evaluation, right? So they're going to give them an opportunity to evaluate the information and the product or service. Trial, right? Leaving samples. Give these to your patients. See how they like them, right? So see if this is something that you could commit to, that you feel comfortable with. It also allows you, when you try something, in order to ask questions, right? And what we're hoping for here is to develop some sort of comfort or commitment to the new product or service. And finally, adoption. And that's where, in that stage, the drug representative becomes very, very important in persuading the physician to move from evaluation and trial to adoption, where you're saying, you know what, when you see a patient who has this particular issue, this is the prescription you are writing. Right? This is what you are recommending and endorsing. The Jackson Behavioral Communication Model, in many ways, is a really easy one to see applied to public relations. So it's suggesting that once people are made aware of a product, a service, or an issue, they begin to formulate a readiness to act. Right? That is stipulated on the fact that the original communication was persuasive. So when they first read about a new product or service, maybe they see an advertisement, they're intrigued. So now we have this latent readiness to act, which simply says that if I see this product at the store, or if someone tells me about it, or there's some way to access it, we think about infomercials and how big that phone number is you can call and how many times you hear it, right? That is the triggering event, right? So it is triggering from this excitement and this where our interest is piqued into the actual behavior. So we are actually calling for the sham wow or whatever else we saw in the information in the infomercial. Or if we've seen ads and we're interested and we're at Meijer or Target and we see the product, then we are actually going to make that purchase. At the end of the day, what this is suggesting is that in order to prompt behavior, PR practitioners must understand the reasons people act the way that they do. Okay, so let's... now we're going to look very quickly at persuasion first versus propaganda. And here, what I want you to think about too is the fact that persuasion is most often grounded in empirical research. Empirical just means observable. So that means we have done focus groups, we have statistical tests, we have anecdotes, but there is a base and a source of credible information that we are drawing from as communicators, as PR practitioners, to help to influence others to make certain decisions. Right? So in here, with persuasion, they tend to be very straightforward messages. A lot of times we are using facts and statistics. We're using logic in many ways in order to persuade people to make certain choices. If we think about propaganda, on the other hand, many ways this is going right for the root of people's emotions. They're seeking to manipulate. So there might be a lack of statistics, there might be a lack of other facts that are stated. We might overemphasize or make something more theatrical. I'm thinking in particular, if we're thinking about two types of advertisement about the hazards of smoking. So if a persuasive one, we're going to use statistics. We might, there's a big push now with these very realistic tobacco ads where they show people who've had a number of surgeries because they have smoked. And they're providing you the facts of how that is impacting their life now. Propaganda, on the other hand, you might have someone who doesn't really need a voice box, but we have an actor who's using one to manipulate the way you feel. Think about using kind of smoke in the background or more dramatic music. We're working to make our viewers feel apprehensive, right? Make them feel threatened. So again, a lot of times it's using a pure emotional appeal or shock value in order to sway the viewer instead of using facts and data. In public relations, in professional communication, you are always working the persuasive angle, never the propaganda angle, right? That is ethically wrong, right? So we're not looking to provide misinformation in any way. So what we are looking at now is in terms of some basic writing skills for public relations practitioners. What I really want you to walk away in the slide knowing is that when you become a public relations practitioner, particularly if you're working in-house, and what that means is you are working for one particular organization and doing their public relations rather than working in an agency. You are going to learn a new language. You are going to learn the jargon of that organization. You are going to understand the policies, the procedures, the services, the products, as well as all of the subject matter experts who create these products and these services. As I mentioned, I used to work in public relations in a healthcare setting. I knew about the different procedures that my service lines were doing. For example, I worked with neuroscience. I had a very, very strong working knowledge of lumbar spinal stenosis, for example. Not necessarily because that's something I wanted to seek out and learn, because, right, like many of you, I was a communication major. But because I had to write about it, because I had to do blog posts on it, because I had to communicate nuances about this particular ailment to lay populations, it was my job to understand that as well as the physicians did. Right? So there you acknowledge in the third bullet point, finely tuned research skills. So making sure that in addition to asking questions to those you are working with, that you're able on your own to go and sort through information and to make sense of it in a meaningful way. In a lot of ways, public relations is like teaching. And I'm drawing that analogy because you need to know the information well enough and in order to teach others. Thinking about communication and persuasive theory. If you haven't already in your public relations major or you want to be a strategic communication practitioner in the future, please take COM 4300. I typically teach it in the spring each semester. It is a large lecture, but it is all about persuasion and social influence. You need to understand how people make decisions. You need to understand how communication through ads, through social media, through verbal delivery, how that impacts the ways in which people decide to engage in certain behaviors. And finally, in public relations, you will be thinking strategically. You will be thinking creatively. You're figuring out, how do I develop, how do I maintain these relationships with my stakeholders, right? And these are things that I'm going to help you work on throughout this semester. But in many ways, these 5 bullet points define what the professional life of a public relations practitioner looks like.